Attachment and Separateness in the Experience of Symbiotic Relatedness by Rachel Blass and Sydney Blatt. Part 1. Introduction, Symbiosis and its Challenges. Symbiosis is a central theoretical construct in a number of psychoanalytic formulations of personality development, yet its validity has recently been challenged. On the basis of a model of development that views self-identity as emerging through a dialectical interaction of two primary developmental lines. Attachment and separateness, we suggest that the intrapsychic state of undifferentiation denoted by the term symbiosis refers to two distinct kinds of experience. In terms of attachment, it refers to an experience of merger. In terms of separateness, to fusion. An examination of these two dimensions clarifies some of the contemporary challenges to the concept of symbiosis and furthers the understanding of the role of the varied experiences of symbiotic unity in development as well as in psychopathology. Purpose of the paper. In this paper, we put forth a new way of looking at the psychoanalytic concept of symbiosis, which provides a response to the latest critiques of the concept. We introduce the concept and then turn to the two major criticisms leveled at it in recent years. We refer to these criticisms as challenges, to which psychoanalysis must respond if the concept is to be useful. We then turn to a developmental perspective to clarify the concept more fully. We contend that one dimension of symbiosis is experiential. Experiential dimension of symbiosis. Experiences of symbiosis are, to a large degree, qualitatively determined by the nature of the developmental aim which underlies them. The link between symbiotic experience and specific developmental aims highlights one aspect of the clinical value of the concept. It enables us to place experiences of symbiosis into the network of existing psychoanalytic formulations and to clarify differences and contradictions between various formulations of symbiosis and the experiences they can encompass. Clinical value of the concept. After clarifying the experiential dimension of symbiosis, we consider its role in early development. We highlight the importance of viewing symbiotic experience within structural development, especially within the interplay between the internalization and integration of experiences of symbiosis and the development of self and object representations. Examination of this complex interaction also provides the basis for a fuller understanding of psychopathology. Thus, we move from development to psychopathology, demonstrating that the concept of symbiosis is central to understanding both normal and impaired psychological development. Historical background and definitions. The concept of symbiosis has been used to describe both intrapsychic and interpersonal states. It has defined a form of mutual dependence. Pollock, 1964. It has been considered both synonymous with primary narcissism, Lowald, 1960, and an expression of early object love, Lichtenstein, 1977, and it has been presented as a necessary stage in both cognitive, Pine, 1985, and emotional development, Giovacchini, 1972. The concept of symbiosis was readily accepted in psychoanalysis with its introduction by Mahler in the 1950s, one probably because of its multiple meanings. Alice Ballant, 1949, and Therese Benedek, 1949, made earlier uses of the term, but Mahler was the first to assign symbiosis a prominent role as a distinctively psychoanalytic concept. Ambiguity and integration into psychoanalysis. Function. Shows how symbiosis bridged classical drive theory and object relational theories. The ambiguity of the concept facilitated the transition from Freud's economic formulations of early psychic development to broader relational frameworks. Thus, for example, while retaining the classical psychoanalytic conception of an original reservoir of libido within an undifferentiated ego with its concomitant omnipotence, the concept of symbiosis at the same time stressed that these narcissistic phenomena take place within the primitive relational context of a dual unity. Mahler, 1968, page 221, n. The ambiguity of the concept allowed for its integration into the divergent streams within psychoanalysis. Melanie Klein's concepts of projective identification, formulations of primary object love emerging from the Hungarian school of object relations, especially A. Ballant and Hermann, Hartmann's and Jacobson's formulations of the development of self and object representations, and Wynne, Nickett's conceptualization of the transitional area all found some common ground with Mahler's broad formulation of symbiosis, Grotstein, 1984a. Undifferentiation as the core concept. Function clarifies that undifferentiation equals the common denominator across all these theories. It is, however, the concept of undifferentiation, rather than the ambiguity of the concept symbiosis, that provides the actual theoretical bridge between Mahler's formulations and those of other psychoanalytic theorists. The essential feature of symbiosis is hallucinatory or delusional, somatocychic omnipotent fusion with the representation of the mother and, in particular, the delusion of a common boundary of the two actually and physically separate individuals, 1968, page 9. We use the term symbiosis to refer to a feature of primitive cognitive affective life wherein the differentiation between self and mother has not taken place, or where regression to that self-object undifferentiated state, which characterized the symbiotic phase, has recurred. Mahler et al. 1975, page 8. Other terms are often used to describe this state of undifferentiation, including merger, David, 1980, Jacobson, 1964, Pine, 1985, fusion, Nacht, 1964, Rose, 1964, 1972, primary narcissism, Grunberger, 1971, projective identification, Klein, 1955, as well as the term undifferentiation itself, Stollerow and Lachman, 1980. While each of these terms denotes additional factors related to the specific theoretical context within which they are situated, they are united by the common dimension of undifferentiation. In his examination of the concepts that have been introduced in various formulations of the symbiotic phase, Lichtenstein, 1961, notes that ultimately all these terms express the fact that the relations between mother and infant, from the infant's viewpoint, represent an inner state of oneness in which there is no differentiation between the infant's I and the mother's, p. 65. 2 challenges to the concept of symbiosis. In the past decade, the validity and usefulness of the concept of symbiosis has been challenged from 2 different directions. Challenge 1. Empirical, infant research. Core idea. Infant studies, Sander, Stern, Vance, Wolf, etc. show differentiation and attunement from birth undermines the notion of primary symbiosis as a normative phase. One direction is empirical and explicitly posed. The major argument is that a normative primary state of undifferentiation is not tenable in light of recent infant research. Numerous studies indicate that interactive, Sander, 1962, 1977, Thoman and Trotter, 1978, affective, Stern, 1985, and cognitive, Vance, 1963, 1965, Krohn, 1966, Lipset and Kay, 1964, Stone, et al., 1973. Capacities of the infant are present at birth and during the first years of development. The general trend is to emphasize the presence, from early on, of functions and structures previously believed to evolve or to be acquired only in the course of many months of interaction within a stimulating and facilitating environment. Mutual behavior regulation of crying, feeding and sleep patterns from the 10th day of life, Sander, 1977. The establishment of patterns of gaze attunement and avoidance between infant and mother during the first quarter of the first year, Beebe and Stern, 1977, Stern, 1971, as well as some earlier studies on the presence of a state of alert inactivity, already at birth, Wolf, 1965, demonstrated that the infant emerges into the world responsive, attuned to her surroundings, and ready to learn from experience. Many researchers and theoreticians concerned with the psychodynamic understanding of early development have concluded that a view of the infant as symbiotically related cannot be maintained. Emd, et al., 1976, Gensbauer, 1982, Milton Klein, 1981, Peter Freund, 1978, Stern, 1985. In a word, the infant senses its separateness. Milton Klein, 1981, page 96. Furthermore, the rejection of an original state of symbiosis leads to rejection of the idea of an ongoing desire to return to that state. If it exists at all, the intrapsychic state of undifferentiation defined by the concept of symbiosis is considered, in this view, to be primarily a manifestation of severe pathology. Eagle, 1984. Challenge 2. Conceptual expansion, blurred meaning. Core idea. Symbiosis stretched from psychosis to normal love/creativity, borderline/narcissistic disorders, transitional phenomena term became too vague. The other major challenge to the concept of symbiosis comes from the expansion of the concept in recent years, which has ultimately blurred its meaning. Mahler, 1952, 1968, originally assigned symbiosis to a specific early developmental period. The continuation of symbiotic relatedness later on in life was thought to be an expression of psychosis. Despite this, almost from the start, there was some recognition of normative ongoing aspects of symbiosis. To some extent, these were considered to be either regressive experiences or moments inherent to any progressive development. Modell, 1968, Pine, 1985, or reflections of the primitive foundations of more mature, internalized relationships. Jacobson, 1964. Alongside the recognition of these normative aspects of symbiosis, however, it was also generally assumed that the maintenance of one's identity through symbiotic relationships reflects severe pathology. Theoretical developments in the past 15 years have led to the reformulation of symbiosis, such that many no longer consider it regressive per se, eschewing the maturity morality implied in such designations. Bakel, 1987. Instead, symbiosis is considered to be an essential component of relatedness to others and as essential to establishing an identity. Ongoing experiences of symbiosis are assumed to be normative throughout the life cycle. The capacity for oneness with objects is never completely lost. The boundaries between the self and object representation within the ego remain somewhat fluid and interchangeable, even into adult life. Rose, 1972, page 182. Giovacchini, 1965, Pollock, 1964, Rose, 1971, Schaefer, 1968, and Silverman, et al., 1982, all described adaptive and constructive uses of this capacity for oneness. Little, 1960, 1981a, and Milner, 1952, 1969, explored the value of ongoing oneness or undifferentiation for mental health. Winnicott and Kahn, in a more implicit way, touched upon similar issues through their examination of the need for transitional relatedness throughout life. Others have discussed the processes of transcendence and crossing of self-boundaries as necessary for sexual union, e.g., Shaskett-Smergel, 1973, David, 1980, Kernberg, 1977. And elements of an undifferentiated relationship have been viewed as essential to the development of the self. Ehrlich and Blatt, 1985. Ehrlich, 1990. Grotstein, 1982, 1983, 1984a, 1984b. Lichtenstein, 1961. Lowald, 1978, page 503. But the growing interest in borderline and narcissistic disorders over the past 2 decades has also indicated that symbiotic relatedness can be associated with non-psychotic forms of psychopathology as well. There are those who have even contended that narcissists should be defined by the fact that their identity depends on the persistence of unconscious fantasies of fusion with objects. Rose, 1972, page 173. See also Rose, 1966, Grunberger, 1971, page 75. These extended uses of the term symbiosis as a process and state throughout the life cycle and the entire spectrum of psychopathology raise questions about the meaning of undifferentiation. Mahler's definitions of the undifferentiation of self and object representations were clear. This clarity derived from her contention that without differentiation, no consolidated self-representation can evolve and there can be no real distinction between self and other or any independent sense of self-identity. This explains why, for Mahler, symbiosis is found only in early infancy, and in Psychosis Point 2 the application in recent years of the concept of symbiosis beyond these two extremes requires revision. This view maintains that the narcissist's concern with merger does not really involve a struggle with the question of identity in the sense of whether I am I. Angel, 1967, Pine, 1985. An additional way that these challenges have been implicitly dealt with is through periodically shifting to undifferentiation in another sense of the term. Instead of denoting a sense of being without boundaries, undifferentiation is used as a term denoting the absence of certain distinctive characteristics that normally develop with maturation, e.g., Eagle, 1984, p. 24, Pine, 1986, page 565. Of Mahler's definitions, the role of symbiotic relatedness in the narcissist's identity, Rose, 1966, is clearly not like its role in the identity of the psychotic. In the narcissist there is undifferentiation and yet a sense of some individuality and the cognitive capacity to distinguish between self and other. The assumption of a normative contribution of symbiotic relatedness to an ongoing sense of identity raises further questions for Mahler's distinction. Thus, underlying the second challenge to the concept of symbiosis is the absence of a theoretical framework that could adequately account for the coexistence of a state of undifferentiation with the existence of an independent identity. Response 1. Distinctions between forms of symbiosis. Core idea. Scholars tried to save the concept by distinguishing actual versus fantasied symbiosis, psychotic versus non-psychotic undifferentiation, cognitive versus affective relational aspects. Author's critique. These distinctions don't fully work because all symbiosis is fantasy, and these criteria can't adequately separate psychosis from borderline/narcissistic disturbances. Two broad responses have been made to these challenges. The first specifies structural differences between different forms of symbiosis, e.g., Ghetto 1981, Stollerow and Lachman 1980. Factors such as volitional control and transience have been suggested as distinguishing normal from psychotic forms of symbiosis. The distinction between actual and fantasied symbiosis has also been implicitly invoked. Such a distinction suggests that undifferentiation is not necessarily antithetical to the existence of an independent identity because in non-psychotic individuals undifferentiation is only a fantasied experience. In actuality, a distinct self has developed. Various combinations of these ideas seem to lie at the foundation of conceptualizations of non-psychotic symbiosis in terms of boundaries that may be suspended. Ehrlich, 1990. Grunberger, 1971. Milner, 1952. Nunberg, 1951. Or transcended. Kernberg, 1977. Or are fluid, hazy, and fragile. Rose, 1972. These ideas also lead to suggestions that cognitive aspects of symbiosis should be distinguished from affective and relational aspects, thus allowing for a symbiotic sense of relatedness to be postulated without interfering with the actual construct of self. Pine, 1986. Robbins, 1981a, 1981b. These formulations not only separate psychotic symbiosis from other forms, but they also respond to the claim that an original state of symbiosis is no longer tenable in light of newly available infant research. The infant may actually be differentiated and have capacities to distinguish self and other, and yet have momentary and fantasied affective experiences of symbiotic relatedness. Pine, 1986.3. It is our view that this kind of formulation is still insufficient to withstand the challenges presently facing the concept of symbiosis. The clear distinction between actual and fantasied symbiosis cannot be maintained because the idea and experience of symbiosis is in all cases a fantasy. Harrison, 1986. Schaefer, 1968. Silverman, et al., 1982. Inasmuch as there is no real state of two people being one, the fantastic experiential nature of the symbiotic relatedness must always be assumed, in psychotic and non-psychotic alike. Furthermore, factors such as volitional control may indeed be available to psychotic and non-psychotic individuals, and there may be differences in the duration of the experience, but this does not enable us to distinguish among the different experiences of symbiotic relatedness in various forms of psychopathology at the moment of these experiences. Some formulations suggest that psychotic, as compared to non-psychotic individuals in states of symbiosis, have not formed a concept of self as separate. Such formulations, however, obscure the fact that the basic sense of self-identity is fundamentally disrupted in severe character disorders, as well as in psychoses. Auerbach and Blatt, 1996. Such formulations also fail to provide a theoretical framework for their implicit distinction between cognitive expressions of symbiosis, found only in the early stages of development, and affective relational aspects, which emerge throughout the life cycle. Pine, 1985, page 247. Response 2. Behavioral evidence versus psychoanalytic conceptualization. Core idea. Infant research shows behavior/differentiation, but this doesn't equate to the infant having a concept of self. Author's critique. This saves symbiosis from outright rejection but fails to provide a positive definition. A second kind of response to the challenges facing the concept of symbiosis stresses the disjunction of behavioral evidence and psychoanalytic conceptualization. Blum, 1989. Dowling, 1989. This kind of response points out, for example, that the capacity for discrimination between stimuli does not imply the existence of a concept of self that could be distinguished from significant figures in the environment, Blass and Blatt, 1985. And if one further argues that the self is not a conceptual or representational construct but rather an experiential integration, Stern, 1985, page 71, then it is not clear what kind of evidence would be hypothetically capable of confirming the existence of a distinct self in contrast to a state of symbiotic relatedness. Zurich, 1992. Hence, the research pointing to primary capacities of discrimination and schematization, Challenge 1, does not pose a real challenge to the concept of symbiosis. We are in agreement with this response, but it is insufficient to uphold the concept of symbiosis. It does not deal with the challenge posed by the pervasiveness of symbiotic states throughout life, partially independent of the severity of pathology, Challenge 2. Moreover, this response does not provide a positive argument in favor of the concept of symbiosis. Through this response to the challenge, the concept is spared rejection on evidential grounds. But inasmuch as this response rests on a recognition of the impossibility of having any objective means of measuring or reading the infant's subjective experience, there is a greater need for positive argumentation. Authors transition beyond negative definition. Core idea. The papers move to define symbiosis positively, not just as lack of differentiation, by tying it to developmental aims, fusion versus merger. The relevance of symbiosis as a dynamic and clinical dimension of psychological development emerges through a further exploration and clarification of the concept. This takes us beyond what is immediately implied by its negative definition as a state of non-differentiation to a fuller articulation of its positive qualities.